Good morning, everyone. This is Tim Gleisner from the Library of Michigan Foundation, or from the Library of Michigan, talking to you today with Jim McCommons from Marquette, Michigan, about his book, Camera Hunter, from University of New Mexico Press. It's a biography on George Shiras III. And just to tell you, if you are wondering how you can contribute or support the Michigan Notable Book Program, at the beginning credits and opening credits, beginning and ending credits of this segment today, you can find contact information for the Library of Michigan Foundation. With that, I'd like to welcome Jim McCommons. How are you today, Jim?
I'm doing well. A little warm, but it's good summer weather here in the UP.
Same here. Very good summer weather. And yeah, a little too warm. And you know, just to tell everybody, this book, what a surprise this book was, a biography on a man who honestly I had never heard about, real influence in Michigan, and not only Michigan, but really the national stage. And Jim, I'd just like to start off to talk today. Give us some background on yourself and how did you become a writer?
I always liked to read books when I was a kid. And when I was 16, I started to work for the local newspaper, the local weekly paper in the small town that I lived in Pennsylvania. And I did mostly photography, but the publisher asked me to write the cut lines, which is the caption right below the picture. Mm-hmm. So I started doing some writing before I left high school. I went to photography school at the Art Institute of Boston. I spent about a year there and then dropped out, partly because I was looking to do something else. And really decided that as much as I like photography, I probably wasn't going to be a photographer. And after about a year later, after going back home actually and working for another newspaper, I decided that I wanted to be a writer and a journalist. And so I went to the University of Pittsburgh in the late 70s, early 80s, which they did not have a journalism program. So I became an English major, and then did some journalism while I was there. And then when I graduated in 81, I started to look for jobs in the Western United States. I really wanted to go live in the Rocky Mountains someplace, work for a small daily, and go hiking and do all those kinds of things. And so I ended up in Wyoming for 2 years. Okay. And then my parents, who were getting elderly, were still living in Pennsylvania, and I decided I want to get a little closer to them. So one day when I was in the public library in Casper, Wyoming, I looked at a map of the Midwest, and I saw this Upper Peninsula. I'd never been there. And so I wrote a series of letters to newspapers across the northern Midwest, and I got a call from the Escanaba Daily Press. This would have been like 1982. Okay. And I came to the UP for the first time to work there. And I was only here for a couple of years, but I met my wife in Escanaba, and so I had this UP connection. But then she and I moved to the east, and we moved to Rochester, New York, where I covered City Hall in Rochester for the paper there. I did some corporate communications work in Detroit. Then I went back to New York because I liked upstate New York, and went to graduate school, to Newhouse School of Journalism. And I also got a master's degree at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So I did a dual master's program. And for about 9 years, I was a freelance magazine writer. And then I went to Rodale Press in Pennsylvania, and did health writing, and I worked for Organic Gardening magazine. From the period that I was in Syracuse, however, I was teaching, and I was teaching part-time as a graduate assistant and then as an adjunct, and I taught down in Allentown too. So a job came open at the Northern Michigan University in 2001. And it just happened to be the only journalism job open. And so here I came back.
Fantastic. So, I mean, not to get too much into the book just yet, I want more information on you, but You know, folks, if you don't know this, I mean, it seems like there's so many parallels between George Shiras and you, the Pennsylvania, the Michigan connection, the natural writing. I mean, was that what attracted you to George Shiras? Did you know all about that, about him when you
No,
first started?
there's a lot of interesting parallels, and I can tell you a story later about how I found some materials. But no, there's a guy here in Marquette who sells vintage photographs, and he gave a talk on George Shiras right after I got here.
Okay.
And I went to it, and then I started to notice all these things in town that were sort of named after George Shiras. And the Peter White Public Library downtown has a George Shiras room upstairs, which is full of these old wildlife conservation books. And they're George's personal collection that he gave to the library, or his estate did. So over the first few years, I started to learn more about George Shiras. And then I was teaching nature writing at Northern Michigan in the fall. And we started to do some field trips out by Whitefish Lake where he did his work. And I came to realize that George Shiras really was a national figure and a pretty extraordinary person who had done some very important environmental work. And so for me, it really fit a lot of my interest, both as a writer and photographer, and also my interest in environmental history.
So you had this whole career of writing, I guess, you know, and this is going to sound kind of maybe simplistic, but why do you write? I mean, why do you feel like it's a good medium that you can express yourself in? Why do you write?
Well, mostly what I've done is journalism. And so for me, it was a way, frankly, to make a living as an English major. Was that experience that I had as at my weekly paper when I was just 16. I said, well, you know, when I leave school, I didn't at that point really want to teach or go on to a graduate degree. I really wanted to get involved in a community and also write about the outdoors. And a newspaper located in a place like that seemed like the best way to do that. So I have done a lot of journalism, a lot of straight news in newspapers, but I really was looking to get into magazines, and I really liked the longer form. And when I started to freelance is when I sort of moved away from newspapers and started to write longer pieces. And you know what I like about it is going out and meeting the people, interviewing them, getting into their life, and then getting into subjects too that I'm really interested in, and writing was a way to do that.
Okay. So how often do you find yourself writing? I mean, how, obviously it's your career, but say like with this book, I mean, was it a daily thing that you set down a word limit that you had to do every day? Or did you feel like, you know, just when the feeling took you, when you felt you had to do it? Like, how often do you find yourself sitting down and actually really putting pen to paper?
Every day.
Every day.
Every day a little bit. I mean, I learned to multitask when I was a journalist. And so if you had 5 minutes between phone calls, you went back to your story and you crafted or you revised your paragraph. And so to some degree every day I've got some material that I'm trying to work on. And so some days it may be 3-4 hours in the morning,
Okay.
writing, and then maybe coming back to it in the evening and revising. This book took a long time, mostly because of the research, more so than the writing.
Well,
And
I wanted to ask you about the research. So, I mean, like, I'm a librarian and archivist. I know what it takes. Now, I noticed a lot of the captions on the photos in the book came from the Northern Michigan University archives, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, there's a good archives. In fact, we've built it up quite a bit. But actually, I brought a lot of that material here for that book.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So, but I mean, like George Shiras, and I apologize about mispronouncing his name earlier. He was in Panama. He was in the Rockies. He was in Alaska. He was on the East Coast, I believe, in the Chesapeake Bay, if memory serves correct in the book. I mean, this man was, did you have to travel to all those places to find pieces of his work? Because I mean, I can't imagine that it was all collated in one place, in one archive.
No, it wasn't. That was the fun part. I got to go to a lot of different places. So I went to Florida where his winter home was in Ormond Beach. I went birding with some people around Cape Canaveral and in that area to talk, to talk about his work down there. He did 3 expeditions in the Yellowstone National Park. And so I went out to Yellowstone Park one fall and spent a couple of weeks out there. I went to archives at Yale University. There were several trips to Washington, D.C., to the Library of Congress, the National Archives, and a couple trips to Pittsburgh as well.
So how did you, I mean, how did you get to go to all those places? Was it just something that you just did with your vacation time from work, or did the university help you with that? How did you actually get to go to all these places?
So the university did help me with that. And so, we get a certain amount of professional development funds each year as a faculty member to go to conferences or to pursue our research. So I used some of those, but one year I won the Peter White Scholar Award, and that's about $17,000. And Peter White was a founder of Marquette. The Peter White Public Library in Marquette is named after him. Yeah. And oddly enough, his daughter married George Shiras III. Yeah. And so there's a family connection there.
Sure.
Well, when that daughter died in the 1940s, she endowed about $100,000 to Northern Michigan University to set up a scholarship fund. And so I got that and was able to apply that to some of my travels. So ironically enough, or appropriately enough, the funds that came through the Peter White fortune and the Shiras fortune helped fund this book all these years later.
That is really ironic. That's amazing. So let me ask about you, just so, you talk about nature writing. So which writers do you really look at, and are any of them, writing biographies like you did on George Shiras? But I mean, like, are you reading people like Aldo Leopold when you talk about nature writers? Like, who are your people that you go to when you want to read?
Well, Aldo Leopold, Edward Hoagland. Right now, what I'm reading a lot more of is I'm reading like Ian Fraser from the New Yorker. I'm looking at, Jonathan Raban, who's a travel writer and an essayist. I read a lot of nonfiction, and I read a lot of folks who are sort of melding nonfiction, well, with their own travel experiences and those kind of things.
Okay, all right. And so tell us, I mean, like you found George Shiras because he obviously was instrumental in Marquette. How did you find out about him? Like, what was it that really grabbed you about this subject to write about? Because as you told me before the interview, you'd never written a biography before. So what compelled you about George Shiras?
So once I realized that Shiras was not only so-called the world's first wildlife photographer, he was also the architect of the Migratory Bird Act, which is probably the most important environmental law of its period. And he just did some amazing things. So the way it worked out was I was in Pittsburgh, and I hadn't been back for many years. And I decided I would go to 3 or 4 libraries, look in the archives there and see what I could find. And I went to the Hillman Library at the University of Pittsburgh campus, a place where I used to hang out when I was an undergrad. And I found a master's thesis written by a woman in 1955 about George Shiras III, the legislator from Pennsylvania, because Shiras was also a legislator in Pennsylvania and also became a congressman as well. So she concentrated mostly on his legislative accomplishments and a little bit on his photography. So I went to the desk, to the reference desk, and said, at the very bottom in the bibliography, it says that this material was taken from the George Shivers III collection at the University of Pittsburgh. And I thought, bingo, I have, I found the Shivers' papers, and they're all collected right here.
Yeah.
And they said, we have no idea what you're talking about, and we don't have any of that. And
Wow.
and I was still in town for another day or two. I was going to go to the Carnegie Museum Library, and then I was going to go to the J. Hines History, Western Pennsylvania History Library. So I gave them my cell phone number, and they called me up the next day, and they said, we found 3 boxes in a warehouse outside of town.
Really?
And you should come look at them. And so what happened was this material had been packed away, sent out to a warehouse that the university had, and they brought them in, and we popped them open, and there were scrapbooks in there that George Shivers had created. There were original letters between Shivers and Theodore Roosevelt, and there was an unfinished autobiography. So there was rich material in these 3 boxes that no one had touched since 1955.
So there was your book right there, right?
Well, I told my wife, when she picked me up later that day, and I said, I think I got enough to write a book. And then it was a matter from that point to build other materials, from there, and to sort out all of this stuff. But it was a great find. And I've talked to other people who have done history books who say the same thing, that there's some point of their research where they just find something that's really been overlooked, or it's still in pristine condition, and there you go. So.
And this man, I mean, he had the Pennsylvania connection. He came from a rich brewery family in Pittsburgh, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And then his father was a Supreme Court justice, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And then they summered up in the UP. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, they were a blue blood family from Pittsburgh. Originally, they were brewers. I mean, the first Shiverses that came to Pittsburgh came right after the Revolutionary War, and they actually bought the remnants of Fort Pitt, which is down on the Golden Triangle of Pittsburgh, nice. and they built a brewery there, and then they shipped out kegs of beer and spirits. In succeeding generations of the family, they became lawyers. And so George, my guy, George Shivers III, his father, George Shivers Jr., became a U.S. Supreme Court justice, went to school at Yale, and then young George followed his father into being a lawyer. The UP connection comes even a little earlier than that. The grandfather was a fly fisherman. And because they had made quite a bit of money in brewing, he was able to retire when he was 30 and pursue this love of fly fishing. And so in 1849, he came to Sault Ste. Marie to fish to St. Mary's River.
Okay.
And then he took a boat down the shore and fished along the way, catching what today we call coaster brook trout, very large trout.
Right.
And he met Peter White when Peter White was just a very young man, and Marquette was just being kind of hacked out of the wilderness, and they became friends. Now, many of the richer families in Pittsburgh would summer in the Great Lakes, somewhere in the Great Lakes. It was cooler. They got out of all that smoke and dirt and pollution in Pittsburgh. During the Gilded Age, Pittsburgh was known as hell with the lid off. And so it wasn't unusual to want to get out. And,
sure.
And because they knew Peter White, and Peter White helped build up the town and became like, this local force in town, they hung out with Peter White when they came up here.
And I mean, you had to learn so much for this book. So there's so many things running through my head about your book right now. So something that really touched me about your book was there was a guide from the UP whose name now is escaping me, but he ended up in the San Juan Islands after he was a guide in the UP, and ended up in Alaska, I believe, via Canada. And at the end of his life, he was in contact with Shiras after many years of absence. And all he wanted to do was come back to the UP. I mean, there was a real love and attachment to that place. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a guy named Jake Brown. He's a good character in the book.
He is a very good character.
And Jake Brown was kind of a teenage friend and a guide for the Shirases during that period. But Jake had a drinking problem. He would come into town and spend all his money, and so he decided that the best thing for him to do was to move to Idaho and work for a hunting club there.
Okay.
But he had great adventures. He went into the Canadian wilderness and walked out there by himself. And then the men lost touch for almost 50 years. And then Jake Brown saw Shiras' pictures in National Geographic and wrote to him. And Shiras was so surprised because he thought Jake had been lost and was dead in the Canadian wilderness someplace.
Well, and that's the thing that fascinated me about your work. There were so many levels to Shiras. I mean, his personal connection to Theodore Roosevelt, the Migratory Bird Act, the constitutional aspects, the separation, or not separation, but states' rights against federal rights when it came to that Migratory Bird Act and things like that. And I know I'm glossing over so much when it comes to this book, but it was just so fascinating. The National Geographic connection. I mean, I had no idea that this man was, he really, in some ways, was instrumental in becoming more of a photography magazine, if you will, instead of like if you could talk about that. And I'm sorry, I know I'm just throwing so much.
No, that's okay. I mean, he started taking these pictures, mostly in Michigan, but in some other places at night of animals, mostly deer. But he also turned his camera during the daylight on birds. But by the time he became a congressman in the early 1900s, 1904, I think, he had a whole series of photographs that he was showing to people, including the Boone and Crockett Club in Washington, D.C. And the Boone and Crockett Club was started by George Bird Grinnell and Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was president at the time, and he was going to these meetings, and Shiras had already gotten to know Roosevelt a little bit. And one night, the new young editor of National Geographic came over, saw these photographs. They were in the form of lantern slides, so they could be projected. And George had a growing national reputation of these wild game photographs, they called them. But what happened was Gilbert Grosvenor, the young editor, and there was only 3 people who worked for National Geographic at the time, was trying to save this magazine, which had few readers and really needed something to pump it up. And he saw these photographs. So he asked George to bring over his photographs so he could see them. And he looked at all of them and said, I want to print them all. And at that point, there were more than 80 that he had taken that were of various animals. So in 1906, he filled up an entire issue with these wild game photographs. And it really caused a sensation with the readers. And it did upset a couple people on the board of management who thought that he was trying to turn it into a cheap picture book.
Right.
But many magazines, many newspapers at this time, because of the changes in technology, were able to use more photographs in their publications. And that's where it started. Shiras' photographs really moved the magazine towards becoming what we know it as today, as great journalism, but marvelous photographs.
And he was really experimenting with nature photography too, right? I mean, he was out at night, and the one emblematic image that sticks with me, and I wish I don't even know what page it's on, the 3 deer at night that were startled by the flash.
That's right.
And they almost look like, quite frankly, and I'm just going to say, they look like wood spirits. I mean, it's just beautiful how these animals said that they were being startled, but at least they weren't being killed. But I mean, it was a really beautiful, was that part of that set of photographs at that point?
Yes, and that was taken out here about 20 miles away at Whitefish Lake.
Okay.
So, what he would do is initially he would go out with Jake Brown, and then later a guy named John Hammer, who became his assistant for the next 30 years after Jake Brown left. But they would go out at night and they would hear these animals on shore. They would push the boat towards the shore, and then they had sort of a lantern at that time made out of kerosene lantern.
Sure.
Hopefully the deer would freeze. If they could get close enough to it, George would stand up with this chemical flash and explode it and take the picture. It took him 3 years to get his first deer picture. So it wasn't an easy thing to do.
Right.
Then what he later thought that he might be able to create a tripwire mechanism for the deer to take their own picture, which is the trail camera. He called it a camera trap. But without a doubt, George Chivers invented the trail camera that a lot of people use today. Of course, we use it with lasers and digital, but it's become an important biological tool. So he was inventing things in order to make this happen. John Hammer, who later became his assistant, also had mechanical abilities, and he helped patent a couple mechanisms for Chivers. But his photographs were quite beautiful. They were like you described. The glass plates were 5x7. The optics were pretty good, and so when he blew these photographs up, they became extremely sharp, and they were pictures of animals that people had really never seen before, particularly the ones taken at night.
Okay. So let me ask, I mean, so again, this book is on so many levels. I loved how, we go into governmental topics about, nature photography, and obviously your background, as you described it, really helped you with this because, the photography aspect, I didn't understand. But with all that, what was the hardest aspect of writing this book for you? Like, what was the thing that was, I don't want to call it a stumbling block, but, what was the hardest aspect for you writing this book, Camera Hunter?
Trying to think, I'd say there were like 3 of them. One is learning the environmental history of that period.
Oh.
This is the early history of conservation. So all of this takes place in the context of the demise of animals through the 19th century.
Sure.
We lost all the buffalo. We lost all the passenger pigeons. There were no game laws. Chivers and the people that he was working with and friends with in Washington were all concerned about that, including Theodore Roosevelt. So that was one thing, was to learn some of the environmental history. And so I had to go back and find a lot of books about that progressive conservation period.
Sure.
2 is to find out who all these people were. Who was William T. Hornaday? He was actually the guy that helped raise buffalo in the Washington Zoo and reintroduce them to the Great Plains. What was the Biological Survey? Who was Frank Chapman? Frank Chapman was a very good friend of Chivers's. He was the chief ornithologist at the New York History Museum.
Okay.
So I had to find who all these people were. Were they important? And then I found out as I was going on, it's like, wow, this guy's really important, and so is that guy. He's friends with all of them.
Right.
And then it was a matter of finding correspondence that allowed me to let these people speak in the book. Because unlike a journalism book that I've done before, I did a book about trains.
Uh-huh.
I was able to go interview all kinds of people. Well, everybody in this book is deceased. And so how do you get them to speak in their own voice? Well, you go to letters, you go to things that they've written, you go to old newspapers and magazines. That's what took an incredibly long time. And at the same time, it was a lot of fun. I wasn't under any great deadline pressures to get the book done.
So a lot of going to the Reader's Digest of periodical literature. Are you looking at magazines from that time period?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Without a doubt. And there were some important magazines at that time.
Oh yeah.
Field and Stream was an important magazine. There were no scientific journals, and so if you were a sportsman or if you were a scientist, you were reading all of these articles. But I guess I remember going to the archives at Yale and looking for one particular piece of information, and then stumbled across all these letters that were answering other letters that I had found 3 or 4 years earlier that I didn't know whether there were answers to. And so, it was like, voila, oh, that's the letter that answers this one from years ago. And I learned a lot about what the Victorians did that period. They did a lot of correspondence. They sat down, they wrote letters every morning. They often had diaries. They talked about, what letter they sent out that day, what letter they received that day. And so I was starting to put some of that together, and that helped a lot too.
So can I ask, as you're writing this, and this is a new genre that you were writing in, is there anyone who reads it for you? Is it your wife, or do you have colleagues that read segments of it, edit, give you hints, tell you, flesh this subject out more, or is it just you?
I wish. I mean, I did a trade book. I did a book called Waiting on a Train.
Okay.
Where I rode all around the United States for Amtrak. And that book, we were able to get out to people who were railroad experts, and they did full reads of it, railroad historians.
Sure.
This was an academic book, and it was much harder to find people to do that, or to find money to pay them to do that. So, no, this book is me. And because it took so long, I learned when I was a freelancer to set things down, come back and be an editor to my own writing.
Okay.
You had to learn how to do that. And so I would set sections down for 2 or 3 months and then go work on another section, then go back and fact check that section, and then read the book through 7 or 8 times. And so that was a little bit, it was copy edited once by the publisher, but I didn't have a content editor like I had with the other book. So everything in there is me.
Okay, very good. So, and it's a beautifully written book. So tell me this, the title, I didn't know what to expect when I first saw that title, to be frank with you. What is the significance of the title, Camera Hunter?
Well, Camera Hunter is kind of what George called himself. No one was really calling anybody a wildlife photographer back then.
Right.
He started to do this around 1885 or so, after he became a lawyer and got married and was living in Pittsburgh. And when he would come home, he was not able to hunt deer in the UP like he used to. Now, part of it was because there were also game laws in 1885, and when he was doing it as a boy, they could hunt year round.
Sure.
And they would hunt at night. In fact, that's how he learned that he could shoot pictures at night, because they used to go out and shoot deer at night with a spotlight.
Right.
That was just the way it was done. They called it fire hunting. But anyway, he came back and he would see these deer around Whitefish Lake, and he wasn't able to hunt them. So then his new hobby was photography. So then he started bringing cameras with him, and he felt that he was hunting with a camera. And that he was a camera hunter. And then when he was writing for Field and Stream and even National Geographic later, he was urging sportsmen to take up the camera as well as the gun. He never got away completely from shooting animals, but he was trying to move people away from the ethic of shooting all the animals you can. And that was often what people would do. And he did it himself. And there's a part in the book where he starts to ruminate about that he was down in the Chesapeake Bay area at a hunting club down there, and he shot 100 ducks. And you can't eat 100 ducks. And he didn't know that many people to give all those ducks away to. So he started to think about the waste, the wanton waste of wildlife. And at the same time, these animal numbers were just dropping. And people were starting to realize that things did have limits, which was, sort of the greater part of the late 19th century, that the frontier doesn't go on forever. The buffalo won't always be there if you massacre them. And that was true of birds as well, which is where his interest in the Migratory Bird Act came from. And there were other people thinking the same thing, but he was the one who had the legal skills to work out the legal foundation for the Migratory Bird Act.
So again, this book is on so many levels, and going back to that research aspect of it, how hard was it to find sources? I mean, again, you're traveling all over, he traveled all over. He's passing things like the Migratory Bird Act, he's summering in Marquette, living in Pittsburgh. I mean, how did you even figure out, like, I should go here, I should go there? Was it just, you'd find one lead and then decide, okay, I got to go out here to follow this up? I'm just fascinated by that.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. When I was in D.C., for instance, I went to the Library of Congress, and I got to sit in the great, reading room and have things brought to me and be a researcher there.
Sure.
But then I knew that, he had spent 2 years on the Public Lands Committee at the House of Representatives. So then I would go over to the National Archives and pull material there. So it's kind of, my train book was like that too. When I first got started, I knew a few people to interview who would talk to me about other people I should interview. And then things slowly happened. Sometimes I had a few experts say, well, you should go look over here. Or again, a piece of material would lead me over to another archive. That I've got a letter here from Hornaday. Well, I should go find Hornaday's papers and go look in those papers and see what I find there.
Okay.
You can get lost in the research.
Completely. And honestly, I kind of love that. That's why I do what I do. So let me ask you, for today, what do you think the relevance is of this work for today? Like, how do you think this would speak to readers who are coming to it right now?
Well, I think part of it is that these folks did recognize that big things had to be done in order to save nature.
Sure.
And the Migratory Bird Act went right up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The decision was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes. It talked about the whole point that birds were disappearing and that the federal government had to take control, had to take action. Otherwise, they were going to cease to exist.
Sure.
And at least some of them were. And they were on the brink of extinction. See, you can relate some of this to these folks dealt with big problems, and those big problems required big action. I think of climate change today, without a doubt, that is this generation's existential crisis.
Sure.
And we're not handling it, and we're not moving towards the goal we need to move towards. And part of it is, it was fascinating where not all of these folks were, government should do everything, but they certainly felt that government had a role, and there were things only government could do. And so from Holmes to Shiras, Theodore Roosevelt, of course, took strong actions to preserve wildlife, set aside lands, and those kind of things. So I think it fits into all that.
Very nice. So in the book, what would be your favorite piece of the book or favorite characters in the book? Anything that stands out for you other than Shiras himself?
Yeah, I mean, Shiras was, from what I got from everybody, Shiras was a good guy. That he was an amiable man, bright, erudite. He was as comfortable hanging out with Theodore Roosevelt and having dinner in the White House with Elihu Root and Howard Taft. And then on the other hand, a few days later, he'd be back in the UP hanging out with Jake Brown, Jack LaPete, and the other people at camp. And so he liked these characters, and they're great characters in the book.
Yeah, they really are.
Yeah. So those are some of my favorites.
Nice. And then, how did you feel when you found out that you became selected as a Michigan Notable Book Author?
Well, I was glad. I also, to some degree, expected it because, and largely I expected it based on who Shivers was.
Okay.
He was an important guy. He did incredibly important work that we still all live with. And he was doing this work in Michigan. He was doing it in the Upper Peninsula. And that was my conviction when I first realized who this guy was and realized somebody ought to do a book about him. And I feel thrilled that I got the Michigan Notable Book, and that's going to bring more attention to his work within Michigan.
And well deserved. I mean, honestly, again, I didn't know anything about him, but I was astounded at his state and national influence. Just wonderful work. So thank you very much, Jim, for this work. And to all of you out there, again, I'm Tim Gleisner. I'm here today with Jim McCommons. We're talking about his work, Camera Hunter. Jim is up in Marquette. The Camera Hunter is about George Shivers III. It's from University of New Mexico Press. And this is, again, part of the 2020 Michigan Notable Books. And if you're looking to support that program, please check out our Library of Michigan Foundation. You can find contact info at the beginning and opening credits of this segment. Jim, thank you for today, and thank you for the talk. And with that, folks, we'll see you again in another segment of the 2020 Michigan Notable Books program.